Today's daf we're going to be learning is Shevuot daf Chet. Today's daf is dedicated in memory of my uncle Richard Cohen, Naftali ben Yosef Cohen Behenna, who passed away this week. He was a man who loved and appreciated every person and was loved and appreciated by everyone who met him. Yehi zichro baruch. Okay, we're going to get started now with the end of yesterday's daf Zayin Amud Bet. I want to just remind you what we're up to and give you an idea of what we're going to cover today. So we saw a drasha yesterday in a braita. The braita was trying to get at it. It was a long braita that started close to the beginning of Amud Bet and went through almost to the end. The braita's goal was to say this. Remember, we have the Shiur right now. Our focus is the goat sin offering. Remember the two that go in the goral. One goes Lazazel and one goes to Hashem. The one that goes to Hashem, the blood is sprinkled inside the kodesh kodashim. That's why it's called the Shiur and Asa Bifnim, because there's another serizim, which we'll touch on later, which is done outside. And that's the one done on the regular altar where most of the sacrifices are done. It's when we say done on the altar, we're talking about the blood being sprinkled. So the blood of the sin offering inside actually is also sprinkled inside the kodesh kodashim, and it's also sprinkled on the parochet in the heichal, in the sanctuary, sprinkled on the parochet, which is the part that separates between the kodesh kodashim and the heichal, the sanctuary. So it's done in the inner part and then the inner part, as opposed to the one that's done outside the heichal, which is the Shiur that's done on the regular, the big altar out there. Now, what does this Shiur atone for? According to the pasuk, we'll start with the pasuk again. The pasuk says, Vayikra, it's actually, Vayikra kaf gimel, okay? I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong one. Vayikra tet zayin. It's in this week's parsha, so it's always fun when that happens. V'chiper ala kodesh mitumot b'nei Israel. It atones, okay, ala kodesh, we talked about this already yesterday, from tumot b'nei Israel and mipeshehem l'chol chatatam. It's very unclear. From the impurities of the Jewish people and from their sins, for all their sins, right? Peshehem is another word for sins. V'chein yaseh la'ol moed, ashocheni tabatoch tumatam, and thus should be done for all moed that dwells among them within their impurities. Okay, that's a completely unclear pasuk what it's talking about. It kind of sounds like it's covering, everything, which is what we kind of would have thought, because the big central korban, and that's why the braita starts off with, you would have thought, what kind of tum'ot? It goes with psha'im and chati'im. Let's come up with the big three: kilorayot, shvichutamim, and avodah zarah. Okay, let's suggest those three. Then the Gemara says, wait, but it can't. The braita says, but wait, it says mi tumatam, which means from, which means not all, and therefore they limit it to korban olevi, to tumat mikdash v'kodashah. Must have to do with impurity in the sanctuary, impurity of going into the temple or eating sacrificial items. And then it says why? Because the Torah distinguished it somehow from all the others. So the first two things we're going to deal with, and I'll stop the braita there, and then we'll go on to the rest and review the rest of the braita as we go along. First part of the braita is to figure out which is it. Is it not those? Oh, it's that. Okay. So the first part is figuring out when they thought the three serious cardinal sins, the question is, what way of doing those sins? So we started off yesterday with avodah zarah, which is, right, what would it be if you did it intentionally so you would get killed? You wouldn't bring this korban. If you did it unwittingly, there's a special korban in Bamidbar chapter 15 that describes what you do if you unwittingly worship avodah zarah. So it wouldn't be this either because it has its own korban, and it's actually an individual korban, which is better than a communal, which just kind of covers everyone, but you have to bring your own. To which they answered, okay, two possibilities, and then we'll start right at the top of our daf after this, which is either it was intentional, but there was no warning, so they can't kill you, so this will atone for you because you need some sort of atonement, or b'shogeg, or unwitting, and you just didn't know. You didn't realize what you did was avodah zarah, and you still haven't figured it out. So it covers you in the interim, which is exactly what this does for tumat mikdash for kodashah. Covers you in the interim, but maybe we would have thought that for avodah zarah. Okay, gilor arayot nami. I'm just to remind you, this is all what you might have thought. This isn't what we do, right? This isn't what it covers. But these are all just you might have thought. And what were you thinking? What was the braita thinking when it suggested? We have to understand what they were even suggesting, which is going to be a lot of what we're doing today, because this braita kept suggesting things and then proving it wrong from a pasuk. And a lot of the drasha we're going to go in, a lot of the delving into this is going to be what were they thinking when they suggested that? Giloi arayot, top of our daf, nami hechidami. What's the case of giloi arayot? Ibn mezid barkat lahu. If it was intentional, then they should be killed, right? Obviously, you get the death penalty for doing giloi arayot. Again, some have death penalty, some are karet, but let's go with the ones that have the death penalty. Ibish shogeg bar korbanhu. And if it's shogeg, so you, by the way, even if it's karet, right? We learned already, you get lashes for that, and it would have its own track. Ibishogeg bar korbanhu. If it's unwitting, also there's a korban. Anything that if you do it intentionally, you get a karet. You also, if you do it unwittingly, you bring a korban chatat. That's what the general sin offering is for. So again, this wouldn't cover you because it has its own track. To which they answer, again, the same answer. So you did it intentionally, but there was no warning, and then they can't kill you, so then this sacrifice would atone for you. Or b'shogeg, because remember, death atones for you, right? When you get the death penalty, that provides atonement. So in the absence of that, we need to come up with some other way. Or b'shogeg v'lo yadale, or you did it unwittingly and you just didn't know you did it. Like, for example, man sleeps with a woman and they don't realize that they're brother and sister, like, or cousin, whatever kind of arayot it is. Somehow they didn't realize the family connection, which could happen in some strange circumstances, possible. Okay, again, this was all what the Gemara, what the braita thought originally that maybe it was going to cover these three sins in this manner. Shvichut damim, also, nami hechidami, also, what's the case? Iba mezid, if you did it intentionally, bar katlu, you get the death penalty. Iba shogeg bar galutu, if it's unwitting, you go to galut. We had a whole chapter about that in Makot. To which the answer, b'mezid below atrabe b'shogeg v'yolo yadale, same answer. It was intentional, but they didn't warn you. It was unintentional, but you didn't know. Okay, could happen. You're in the, if we go to the classic case, you're in the forest and your thing goes flying out and it kills someone, but you didn't even see, right? It went far, killed someone, and you didn't even know you killed someone. So this would cover you. That was the suggestion. Or inami, here's another possibility. In shkaga, in murder, we have another possibility for shkaga. Bahanach de la b'nei galutnin. There's all these people who can't go to galut. We learned a lot about that. If you're karav l'mezid, karav la'ones, if it's right close to intentional, we don't let you go to the your miklat, to the refuge city. If it's close to ones, where it was really, really unexpected, we don't make you go. But both those people still need atonement, okay? So therefore, maybe this sacrifice would have covered it. So now we go to the next line, and each time we go back to the braita, it's going to introduce it by Amar Mar. So that was section 1, understanding what the braita was even thinking when they suggested that these are all possibilities. Now they move on and they say, okay, next line. Yachol, we're going to literally go through every line of this braita. Yachol al shalosh tumot halalu yehi seir mechapel. You would have thought for these 3 tumot, the seir would atone for. Talmud lomar, mi tumot v'lo kol tumot. It says from the tumah, from is always limiting. So it's not 3, that's too many, limited to something in particular. How are we going to figure out to what? Well, ma matzinu shechalaka katuv michlal kol hatumot. Where do we see a case of impurity that's different from any other type of impurity? B'tumat mikdash v'kodashav. In tumat mikdash v'kodashav, it's unique. Okay, there's something unique about this sacrifice that you bring, that because of that, we're going to assume, since tumat mikdash v'kodashav has a uniqueness to it, which we'll see in a minute what's the uniqueness, therefore that must be the one. Because if you're going to say it applies to one thing, you have to have something that stands alone. It's also why they took the 3, because the 3 stand alone, right? We learned about them in Sanhedrin, Yehareg, Val Yavor. They're the 3 sins that you cannot do even if someone puts a gun to your head. So because of that, we need something that's completely distinguished. So Avkan b'tumat mikdash v'kodashav. So just like tumat mikdash v'kodashav has some unique halacha, that must be the one they're talking about here. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That's Rabbi Yehuda. If you remember, Rabbi Shimon says, I don't need your whole chalaka katuv, that whole thing. I don't need to go with that because it says it simply in the pasuk. The pasuk started off, v'chiper ala kodesh mitumot b'nei Israel. Kodesh, what is kodesh if not kodashim, right? And we're talking about tuma, kodesh. Oh, that's our topic. Okay, so he has a totally different way of reading the pasuk. We'll get back to that soon. My chalak, so how is it distinguished? D'maite ba'ola v'yored. Because any other sin offering that we bring has to be an animal. This one is a sliding scale offering.
This korban chatat is unique. You do this sin of tumat mikdash kodashim. You went into the temple impure. You went into you ate sacrificial items when you were impure. You have this certain, okay, now we're going to learn that unique is unique and easier, right? We're going to be more lenient on you here. And because we're going to be more lenient on you here, we're going to give you an extra opportunity to atone for this sin on Yom Kippur. So what's the whole idea of the sliding scale offering? That we can basically allow you to have, right, different possibilities based on your financial means. So now they say, now we're going to have 4 other suggestions that we could have said. Okay, 4 possibilities of what else could have been chalaka katuv, right? There's lots of things that are unique. So maybe it's something else. Okay. And the siman, they put the siman a little bit after, but avodah zarah, yoledet, mitzvah, nazir, shenitma. Okay, those are the 4 things we're going to see. So aim avodah zarah. Why don't you say avodah zarah instead of this tumat mikdash v'kodashav? Umay chalak, demaiti seira v'lo kispa. I told you before that there's a unique korban for the avodah zarah, for someone who unwittingly does avodah zarah. In general, when you do a sin unwittingly, you bring a korban chatat, and it could be either a sira or a kispa. Okay, it could either be a female goat or a female lamb. But when it comes to, or I think it could be even a male lamb, I'm not sure. I don't know, remember all the details, but we'll get to that in Zvachim. But you have possibilities. In avodah zarah, you have no possibilities. It has to be a sira. If you don't have one, you can't bring it. So there you see, it's got some uniqueness to it. It's right. You would say like it stands alone. Amarav Kana kind of says, don't use that as your example. Anan chalak lahakel kamrina. V'hai chalak lahachmirhu. Our case is it's unique and lenient because you can bring a sliding scale offering. If you don't have the money, you can bring something much cheaper. But this is a chumrah. We're not looking for chumras here. The whole idea is there's some leniency, and because of that, you're going to get this extra atonement from the sacrifice. So no, not that one. Okay, option 2. Now, option 2, 3, and 4 are going to be other cases in the Torah where the Torah gives you possibilities. If you can't afford this, bring that. Okay, for these, it's going to be the yoledet, it's the mitzvah, the leper, and the nazir who becomes impure. They all bring sin offerings where there's possibilities. It's either animals or birds. Okay, so they're also going to be, we're going to say, if the whole issue is we're going to be more lenient, and it's because we're giving you possibilities to do something less expensive, well, here's 3 examples, and why don't we use those? So, ema yoledet. What's a yoledet? A woman gives birth, if you remember, after either 40 days or 80 days. And all those days, she has any blood she sees, right? In the first X number of days, depending on male, female, it's impure blood. After that, it's pure blood, but she still can't go into the temple or eat sacrificial meat until either the 40 days for a boy, 80 days for a girl. She gave birth to a girl. And then she brings a sacrifice, and that permits her to go into the temple and to eat sacrificial items. So there, the chalak, the maite olevi ored, there also she has possibilities. She can bring an animal or a bird offering or a combo offering. So there's possibilities. So that would be also distinguished from the usual sin offering. So Amar Rav Hoshaya, lechol chatotam velo lechol tumatam. Wait a minute. What's the purpose of her bringing a sin offering? It's a very weird sin offering because why is it called a sin offering? A woman who gives birth doesn't do a sin, right? But that's what Rav Hoshaya says. Look at the pasuk. This pasuk is atoning for lechol chatatam, for sins, not for impurities. Her sacrifice is, yes, it's a sliding scale offering, but it's not to atone for a sin. It's to get her beyond this state of impurity. It's to turn her from a state of impurity to purity, and that allows her to eat the sacrificial items and go into the temple. So that's not the same thing. We need this isn't going to atone for her. First of all, it would be interesting. What would it mean? It would mean that let's say a woman gives birth 10 days before Yom Kippur. The Seir on Yom Kippur would basically allow her to eat sacrificial meat, right? It would cover her. It's almost like how a holiday breaks Shiva, that like these days would be broken by her bringing a sacrifice, okay? It would be weird, but not her bringing. It would be, right? The communal offering of the Seir brought inside allows all Yoldot now to go into the temple. That would be again, it's just a suggestion. It's not what I'm saying. But the point is, it doesn't, that's to create, that's to
create the switch from impurity to purity, not from transgression to being absolved of transgression. And we're talking about a Shiur and Yom Kippur, and it says it's to atone. What about Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, which you might remember? Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, the Amar Yoledet Nami Choteti. He calls it Yoledet a Chotet. It's very famous. Okay, we had the same thing with the nazir, and we're going to get to that. Right? These people bring sin offerings, but they didn't really sin. Well, he says they did. What do you mean? When she was in childbirth, right? Most women curse, and they said they were never going to have children again, and they need to atone for that. So Ma'i Kalamemar, according to him, this is a sin, and then maybe it really does atone for her. Well, we have a very easy answer now. If you didn't remember this, the regular Rabbi Shimon that we always talk about in the Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. So Rabbi Shimon appears in our braita, and notice where he appears. Remember, Rabbi Shimon l'tamei demar mukamo mucha. This is all to explain Rabbi Yehuda's position, not Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon doesn't know about this position. So you don't have to say, how does Rabbi Shimon's position fit in with this? Because Rabbi Shimon doesn't even agree with this position. So it's not a problem at all. Third suggestion, Ema Mitzora. What about a leper who also brings a chata, which is a sliding scale? He has possibilities if he can't afford the animal. It's the same answer. Okay, we're going to have the same answer for the next three. Again, what's unique about the Mitzora and the Nazir and the Yoledet? All of them are trying to get out of a state of impurity. Okay, we'll talk about the Nazir in a minute because we're not talking about a regular Nazir. We're talking about a Nazir who became impure to a dead body. Okay, and then they have to get out of that and restart their Nazirut. So for all these people, it's going to be a process of tumah tara and not sin to absolve for atonement for the sin. So l'chol chatatam v'lo l'chol tumatam, right? So Rav Shaya says, because the pasuk says chatatam and not tumatam, therefore it's not that. What about Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani D'Amar? We're going to have the same question every time. Al shiv'ad varim nigaim ba'im. There's 7 sins on which you become leprous. One of them is the famous one of lashon hara. Okay, I'm not going to go through all 7, but there's a Gemara about all the 7 things that cause you to become a leper. Ma'i kalamemar. So what are you going to say? It is a sin and it needs atonement. So the korban is a korban of atonement. To which the Gemara says, no, that's not true. Hatam nige de ichaperle, the korban lishtuye bakahal. What atones for your sin? The leprosy atones for your sin. The korban of a leper is not atoning for the sins that caused your leprosy. Okay? The korban is allowing you to go back into the community. It is moving you from tumah to tara. Okay? A leper has to leave the community. Once has to leave the camp, has to live separately. Once they get the atonement, they have number 1, the process of atonement. That happens by being a leper. That whole process of having leprosy atones for the sins. That's the whole idea. You sinned, your punishment, which your punishment is also your atonement, is becoming a leper. Then you need to get out of a status of leprosy, and for that you need to do the korban, and that moves you from impurity to purity and allows you to go back into the camp. So yes, even though leprosy might be on account of a sin, the korban is definitely not atoning for that sin. Be'ema nazir tameh. What about a nazir who became impure? Dechalak, demaite torim ubnei yonah. There you bring bird offerings. Amar Rav Hoshaya lechol chatatam v'lo lechol tumatam. Again, the leper has to get out of the state of impurity and be able to move to restart the nazirut and become a nazir who's pure. And the korban allows for that. It's not atoning for anything. To which they say, what about the Rabbi Elazar Kapal, Damal, Nazir Nami Chotehu? This is very famous. Is a Nazir a good thing or a bad thing, right? Rabbi Elazar Kapar said to become a Nazir is not an ideal. It's the opposite. Someone who has to swear off or vow off of wine, that's a bad thing. That's not good. That means someone has trouble controlling themselves, and the only way to do it is to make this vow. That's not a good thing. We don't look at that, and we view that as a sin, right? God, forbade lots of things. Did it forbid this? Who are you to come and forbid more things? So, therefore, which is interesting because we're in Shevuot, which is all about taking vows and forbidding things to yourself, right? Which you see, he definitely has an approach that's not the way to go. So, according to him, it is a sin. So, how are you going to explain that? Very easily, like we said before, except it's not as easy because it's someone else. But we could say that he holds like Rabbi Shimon's position. Before it was easier, it was Rabbi Shimon himself. But we could say he holds like Rabbi Shimon, And we don't have to explain him within here why, according to Rabbi Yehuda, did he not use the example of the chalak? Why wouldn't you say a nazir is also chalak? No, because he just doesn't even hold by that approach. Okay, he goes with Rabbi Shimon and learns it out from the pasuk directly. Okay, so the first two things we did, just to review, because it's a bit of a confusing daf, it's not so hard, but it's good to always get in context. First we did was explain the shalosh tum'ot and what even the Gemara was thinking when they said that. Now we move into what does it mean chalak? In the end, it's not the three. It's this one because it's with tumat mikdash, because it says mitumot and it's not all tumot. So we limit it to which one? To the one that stands alone. Why does it stand alone? What about these other ones, right? Because it's korban lev yared. What about the other ones? Well, the avodah zarah stands alone, the chumrah. We don't want that. We want the kula. Then we went through nazir, yoledet, nazir shetameh, yoledet, and a leper. And we said, no, those are different. Their korban is not, even though it's a chatat, it's technically a sin offering. And this, by the way, highlights that, and we'll talk about this, I guess, when we get to zvachim, about the korban chatat. Generally, we view chatat as a sin offering, but there are some unique korbanot chatat that aren't sin offerings. Okay, or, then you take the approach of Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Lazar Kapar, they are sin offerings, right? That's the struggle. Why are they called sin offerings if there's no sin? So they try to come up with there is some sin. But if you don't view that, then they're in a different category. And here, what's nice is the Gemara really defines what's different about them. They're moving you from impurity to purity, as opposed to sin to atonement. Okay? Next, Amar Mar. Next line is Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon omer, mim kamohu muchva, harei omer v'chiper ala kodesh mitumot. Okay, so now we're going to explain this. Where do we get it from? How do we get it from the pasuk? What does it mean? Chiper ala kodesh mitumot. Mitumato shel kodesh. They read it as, instead of a kodesh mitumot, it's mitumot of kodesh. Okay, from impurities that relate to sanctified items, and that would be our topic. So now they say, okay, you know what? Shabir ka'amar Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon has a very strong claim. Why did Rabbi Yehuda have to come up with this? Chalak, hakatuv. Why didn't Rabbi Yehuda just accept Rabbi Shimon's position? The Gemara likes to do that sometimes. And one answer seems so obvious. Well, how did someone come up with something else? So Rabbi Shimon amar lecha, he needs the words for something else. He understands kodesh. Okay, the word kodesh can mean lots of things. Right? Rabbi Shimon said it means sacrificial items. Kodesh is a place. Where is the place of kodesh? The heichal, the sanctuary. And what he wants to tell you is, right, this is called the seir nasa bifnim. Now, bifnim is actually two areas. Bifnim generally means the heichal, the sanctuary. That's where the shulchan, the menorah, and the golden altar was, the small one for the incense. It also means bifnim, which is the kodesh kodashim. Now, this sacrifice, the blood is sprinkled. What we do is, remember, the Kohen Gadol takes the blood of the seir, that's the one we're talking about, and the blood of the par, which is the unique korban he brings for himself and the kohanim, and he mixes the bloods together, and then he sprinkles the blood inside by the aron, and then he sprinkles it outside, but not outside, in the heichal, in the sanctuary, which, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is learned from the word kodesh. The chiper ala kodesh. Now, what is kapara? In sacrifices, kapara is achieved by sprinkling the blood. So he says, that's what we're talking about. That beginning of the pasuk is telling you, whatever we did inside, we're now going to also do b'chiper ala kodesh. We're going to do it in the kodesh, in the sanctuary. So again, kodesh doesn't mean items, it means a place, a location. So that's what he uses those words for, and therefore it's not free to teach what Rabbi Shimon wants to learn about, what the sacrifice is atoning for. Rabbi Shimon, so where does Rabbi Shimon get that you do it inside? In the sanctuary also. Okay, if you look at the end of that pasuk, which I read in the beginning of class, but you probably didn't pay attention to those words, it says, that's what the braita was busy darshaning, all those words, from tumatam. Okay, we'll get back to the mi pishehem l'chol chatotam. If you don't remember those drashot, we're going to see them from the braita later today. And thus you should do, meaning, and do the same thing in all moed. What's all moed? The sanctuary. Okay, the heichal. So that's where he gets it from. So actually, that's a pretty good one. Why didn't Rabbi Yehuda learn it from there? It's a little more clear from there. Rabbi Yehuda, right? We're doing this ping pong now. What does each one do with what? If you say, this is a classic example of not being clear what you mean. You say, right, do this, and then do it in Ol Moed. You might have thought, start the whole process again. Get another seir, get another par, slaughter them, take the blood, sprinkle it. You would have thought it's a different animals you need to do it with. That's why he didn't want to learn it from there, because if you learn it from there, it gets very confusing. If you learn it from B'chiper ala kodesh, then it just means it's the blood. Take the blood and put it in the kodesh also. So kamash malan, that's why. That's why you wanted to learn from the beginning of the pasuk to teach you, no, it's not the blood. For Rabbi Shimon, v'chein yaseh la'ol moed, now Rabbi Shimon's going to say, v'chein yaseh la'ol moed minei mashma. He says when it says v'chein yaseh la'ol moed, it means from that blood that you already have. He didn't think that you would come, right? Rabbi Yehuda was concerned that you would come to the conclusion that maybe you have to start the whole process again. Rabbi Shimon doesn't read the pasuk that way. He thinks it's pretty obvious you don't need to, and therefore he didn't say anything about this. Okay, so now we basically have why Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda each had different positions here, why Rabbi Shimon learns it from the pasuk and Rabbi Yehuda doesn't, because Rabbi Yehuda needs it for something else. And then we go back and forth. Why did Rabbi Shimon learn that from there? Where does he learn that from? And back and forth. Next section. Amar. Now we're going to get into what does this, okay, that was all to establish until now. What we've established is it's Nakilor, Shvichut Damim, and Avodah Zarah. It's Tumat Mikdash for Kodashim. However, Tumat Mikdash for Kodashim is 3 different cases, right? Or 4 really. Okay, we're going to put one aside that we're not going to even deal with, which is no yediyah at all. You didn't know you were tamei. You went into the temple or ate sacrificial items, and you still don't know. Okay, that's a totally different category that we have other korbanot to deal with. Then we have, right, this is all the first, right, the first shiur of Shevuot. Then we have, you knew about it, you forgot, and then you knew about it again. That's the other extreme, and then you realized your mistake. For that, you have an individual sin offering, right? That's the Korban Levi Yored. That's our classic case. And then you have 2 cases in the middle. And one, if you remember, is dealt with by this one. And one is dealt with the seir that's done in the outer altar on Yom Kippur. Okay, so we have those 2, which is Yediyah in the beginning, then you forgot, and then you still haven't figured out that you made a mistake. Okay, you went into the temple, but you still haven't figured it out. That's what this seir that we've been talking about atones for. And then there's the one that's you didn't even know in the beginning you were tamei. You went to the temple not having any idea you were tamei, and then later you found out. Okay, so the yediyah comes at the end. So now the braita says, so yachol al kol tumot shebekodesh seir ze mechaper. Maybe it's atones for all these cases, or really they don't mean all right now. What they're really going to suggest is the main korban levi yored, yediyah b'tchila, yediyah b'sof, and helen be'emtza, where you know now and you knew before. So maybe it'll cover that. Talmud Lomar, mi pishehem l'chol chatotam. Okay, you have to look back in the Gemara now, in the braita, and it's in yesterday's Gemara, because they don't quote you the whole thing. And they say, we need to have sins that are like psha'im. Now, what's unique about psha'im? Ma psha'im she'inam b'nei korban. You do something intentional, you don't bring a sin offering. Sin offerings are only for unwitting. Av chata'im she'inam b'nei korban. So the sins that this is going to atone for are ones that don't have a sacrifice. This one has a sacrifice, the korban levi yored, right? You bring an individual sacrifice, that atones for you. You don't need this to atone for something that you have your own individual sacrifice to atone for. So that's the drasha. So now they say, my nihu. So what case are they trying to exclude from here? And that's obvious. They're trying to exclude the one that has a korban, which is, I'm reading now back in our Gemara, we're at the very bottom of Chet Amud Aleph. Yesh b'yidiyah b'tchila, v'yesh b'yidiyah b'sof, habar korban hu. Why would it's obvious that the one they're trying to exclude is you have knowledge at the beginning and you have knowledge at the end. But why would you need to exclude that case? It has its own korban. Why would you even think that the seir is mechaper for something that has its own korban? It doesn't even make any sense. Again, we're struggling with understanding what the Gemara, right? Obviously the Gemara rejects this suggestion, but what were they even thinking when they suggested that? Just like we started our daf. This is an interesting case. What if you realize right as Yom Kippur is starting, and then you go into Yom Kippur? Okay, you can view this as a very, I'm going to explain this in 2 different ways. Okay, I'm going to explain this in the very classic Gemara coming up with some crazy radical random suggestion. Okay, like exactly at the moment that Yom Kippur was about to start, all of a sudden you realize that you made this mistake, and now you have nothing to do about it until Yom Kippur is over, right? Because you can't bring an individual sin offering on Yom Kippur. The only sacrifices we allow on Yom Kippur, Shabbat, and all that are the ones that you're obligated for the day. So Salkadat Achamina, you might thought, Adimaite nitlele. Maybe this one will at least cover you, right? The seir that's done bifnim will cover that case until such time that you can bring the sacrifice the day after Yom Kippur. That's what the Gemara is suggesting. Kamash malan. And that's why the braita says, no, the drasha comes to teach you, no, it has to be something that doesn't have a korban for it. Now I'm going to explain the whole thing in a different way, in a more interesting way, which is, imagine you're right before Yom Kippur and you become introspective and you kind of think about, you look back at your year and then all of a sudden, looking back at your year, you remember, wow, I can't believe I did that. And now you have to sit through Yom Kippur knowing you have this sin on your head, that you have nothing you can do about it, right? Now it's like a whole different situation if you think about it that way, right? It's tormenting. This isn't just a random, technical whatever, but you have to sit on your Yom Kippur all day long. You're sitting there davening and all that and knowing that you have got a sin on your head, that there's nothing you can do about it. Usually Yom Kippur atones for everything, and now you're stuck on Yom Kippur with this thing you can't deal with. So maybe, and that's a whole different way of looking at it, that would be a real, that would make a lot of logical sense that we'd want to allow this. Okay. But in any case, the drasha comes to tell you this doesn't cover it, okay? Whether it's a technical thing or whether it's a real thing that you can understand in that kind of way. But either which way, it doesn't cover. Okay, next. Amar, okay, we're at the top of Amabet. Minayin sheyesh b'yediah b'tchila ve'ein b'yediah b'sof sheseir zeh toleh. Okay, so now the Gemara, the braita. Okay, again, we're back to the braita. Now, this covered, the first part covered, how do we know it's not the knowledge at the beginning, knowledge at the end, and that's because it has its own korban. But what about, how do we know it's yediah b'tchila ve'ein b'yediah b'sof and not the reverse, right? It could have been, you didn't know about it in the beginning, and then you found out about it later. And that you can't bring your own korban, individual korban, so maybe we'll cover that. Now, the braita says, the reason is, Talmud Lamal, and that's actually the last line of the braita, L'chol chatatam, because it says L'chol chatatam, now we normally think chatatam means sins. In this case, they darshan it, chayaveh chataot b'mashma. It has to be a something, this is going to provide you for atonement for something that eventually you can bring a korban chatat for. The chatat here, chatotam, is a sin offerings. This could lead to a future sin offering. Now, if you didn't have knowledge of this to begin with, and then you went into the temple, and then you found out about it later, you will never be able to bring a sin offering for that, an individual sin offering, because an individual sin offering is only, you have to have knowledge in the beginning. You can't create that knowledge later and say retroactively there was knowledge in the beginning. There wasn't knowledge of it in the beginning. You didn't know you were impure. And you only found that out later. Well, it's always going to be that you found it out later. And you'll never be able to bring a sin offering. So what this is going to atone for is something that right now you can't atone for it because you haven't figured out that you've done it wrong. But when you find out that you did it wrong, you actually will be obligated to bring a sin offering. That's what we're looking for. That's what the drasha is telling you. It has to be that criteria. So now the Gemara says, Minayin makakashele. Why were they thinking it would be the other case? What was the Gemara struggling with? They had to ask this question in the first place. Why did they think maybe it would include case, I would call it case 3, right? Case 1 is yediah b'tchila, yediah b'sof. Case 2 is yediah b'tchila, not at the end. Case 3 is didn't know about it at the end, but you did find out about it later. So why would you have thought? Like, what's the difficulty? They say, hachi kakashile. This is what was disturbing them. Shiur, they were questioning. Again, we're back to all the Havaminas today, right? It's all, why were they thinking this in the first place? Now, this is going to make a lot of sense. We just said in the previous section, it has to be like a pesha. Right? Pshi'ah is something you do intentionally. Now, something you do intentionally doesn't have a sacrifice, doesn't have a way to atone through sacrifice ever, right? So if we learned that it's not going to be the yediah, right? Case 1, yediah b'tchila, yediah b'sof, because that has its own korban, and because we learned from Sha'im, which, right, delav, map Sha'im delav b'nei korban, ap chatim nami delav b'nei korban. It has to be something that doesn't have a korban, and that's why case 1 is out. But you might have thought that might opt us out of case 2 as well, because Ema, you would say map Sha'im delav b'nei korban la'olam, since you can never atone for intentional sins. That's even down the road, right? Once once you do something intentional, there's no sin offering for it. You can't ever bring a sin offering for it. There, by the way, are a few unique cases of intentional where you do bring some sort of korban, but in general, they're not. We'll talk about them much later in Masechet Shevuot. Av chataim delav b'nei korban la'olam. Okay, likewise, you might have thought that this atones for sins that can never get to a korban. And that wouldn't be this case. What would be? That would be the case of case 3. Ein ba'yidiyah b'tchila, v'yesh ba'yidiyah b'sof. Because you didn't know about it in the beginning, you'll never be able to bring a sin offering about it because that's not what you bring a sin offering for. The individual sin offering has to have yidiyah b'tchila. But if I'm right now, and I knew it at the time, then I did the sin, I forgot. And I still haven't remembered, but when I remember, I'll be obligated a sin offering. Maybe that's not, right? That's the case where you bring the Shiur. But right, that's what the Shiur covers. But why? It doesn't seem to fit the criteria we just said, because it should be like Pshi'ah, which never has a sin offering associated with it. Aval, right? And that's what we're going to say now. Yesh b'yidiyah b'tchila, the case that we said this is about, right? You knew about in the beginning, ve'ein b'yidiyah b'sof, kevan dechi mityadale, once you find out about it, bar korbanhu, when you find out 5 months later that way back when you went into the temple when you were impure and you say, oh, now I remember, and then you'll have to bring your own korban, so emelo lile, maybe this korban doesn't cover people like that because it doesn't fit in with the drasha we just said in the previous section, like psha'im, like intentional sins. The chitema, now if you want to say, you can't say that because we know that's not the case. Why do we know it's not the case? Well, we know that ein b'yidiyah b'tchila v'yesh b'yidiyah b'sof, which we're trying to put on this seir, we know that's covered by a different seir. Remember? Seir hanasa b'chutz v'yom kippurim mechapel. Back to the first Mishnah. If you don't have knowledge in the beginning, and then you went into the temple, and later you find out you did all this, the seir that's done on the outer altar covers you, right? That goes sin offering. So right now, the braita was suggesting, based on this, which we just explained, right? It wasn't clear in the braita, that's why. But now we're explaining, the braita thought it has to be like pshi'ah, like intentional sins, which never have a korban. And then that would be the obvious answer. But that can't be the obvious answer either for a different reason, because that's covered by a different sacrifice. Well, well, we would have just swapped them, okay? That's what they were thinking. They were thinking that maybe this one would go there and that one would go there, okay? That if we have this Rashav Shia, learning it from there, it would make more sense to flip them and say the Seir that's Bachutz is for the one that could eventually lead to a korban, because there's no drasha saying not. Ours is going to be the one that can never lead to a korban. And that's what the Havamina is. And therefore, they say no. Again, okay, and I reminded you of this a few minutes ago. But now, what is the braita answer? Bottom line, Amar Kra, why not? Why is it not this way? L'chol chatatam. And the chatatam, they don't learn as sin, but they learn as a chatat, a sin offering. Michlal d'bnei chataot inu. This comes to teach you it's something that could become its own korban chatat. It's something that could lead. And the not yidiyah in the beginning will never lead to a korban chatat, and therefore no. Now we have a little bit more to finish up before we finish this whole section on the braita, which is, okay, if this atones, now we have some basic questions. We're done with like each line of the braita and darshaning. Mostly what we did today was try to figure out the havaminas, what they were thinking, and a little bit understand the drashot that said, no, it's not the case. Okay, now we say, v'nitchaper kapara gemura. Now, a minute ago, we just said, when you eventually find out after Yom Kippur, okay, this atones for you only temporarily, okay? But nitkaper kapara gemura, why temporarily? If this atones for these kind of sins, it should atone for them completely. Why do you later, when you figure it out, you have to bring a sin offering? By the way, there's another model for this, if you remember. We'll get to this when we get to Zvachim. Asham talui. What's an asham talui? It's a case where you're not sure if you did a sin. Okay, the classic is eating chelev. It's a forbidden fat on animals. And it looks a lot like shuman, like regular fat, which is permitted. So the question is, if you're not sure if you ate chelev or shuman, what do? Well, in the interim, you bring an asham talui. But notice the name, talui. It's a hanging asham. It's waiting until such time that you figure out. It atones for you temporarily, but it doesn't atone for you completely. If you eventually find out, then you have to bring a regular chatat. So the same thing here, but right now they want to understand, why is this? Shouldn't it just atone completely? Well, iktiv me chatatam kidekar marta. If the pasuk had said, l'chol peshehem mechatotam, from your sins. It would mean this absolves you of your sins. But Hashidikti, that's not what the pasuk says. The pasuk says lechol chatatam. And the way they understand lechol chatatam, for your sins, like for until you bring a sin offering. Remember, we said chatatam was sin offering. Le is to also, like to the sin offering, like until you get to the sin offering. Lahanach de'atu lechal chatat. It's for those who could eventually become obligate you in a sin offering. And then when it does, you're going to have to bring one. So then they ask the obvious question. So if it's not going to atone for you, then what does it do anyway, right? What's the point? To which Amar Rabbi Zera, we're going to have two answers. And the first one, Rav is going to reject and then bring his own. Amar Rabbi Zera, lo marsha mate below avon. What if you die before you figure it out? So at least you'll die without a sin on your head. Amar le Rava, mate mitama mereket. But there's this thing, the death itself atones for you. Ela Amar Rava, lahagen alav minei yisurim. So Rava says it's to prevent you from having suffering on account that you have a sin on your head. That goes back to this image I told you of sitting on Yom Kippur, knowing you have a sin on your head. You don't want to be in that state because you could have all sorts of sufferings coming upon you because of that. So it covers you for that, but it doesn't completely atone for the sin. Okay, so just a quick review of this, and then we'll finish up with the daf, which is a very short part, but we're already going back to the Mishnah, so I want to review now before we move on, which is, what we did now is we went through the different sections. What kind of case of the three sins did they even suggest? And then why did they reject it? And why did they say specifically that? And that's because lechalek, but why is it different? Why chilek hakatuv here? How is it different? And why not all four other ones that are different in terms of their sacrifices? Then we got to Rabbi Shimon, and then the difference between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda and their positions, and why Rabbi Yehuda didn't adopt the more obvious Rabbi Shimon's position. Then we got to, you would have thought that maybe, right, why did they think that maybe it would be on the one that already has its own korban? That doesn't make so much sense. So what was the havamina there? And what did they think about, why did they then jump to think it was the other one, the one number 3 in the list? And what was the thought process there? And it doesn't make so much sense either until they figured out what we thought that. And then if it's not going to completely atone, then what is it doing? Okay, now we end with the Mishnah. The Mishnah goes back and says, okay, so the Mishnah had said, this is again case 3. You didn't know about it before. Then you sinned, and then you figured it out that you sinned. So that's the seir that the blood is sprinkled on the regular altar, the one that's outside the sanctuary. That one atones. And it says there, they don't quote you the important part. Where do we learn it from? Because it says, milvad chatat kippurim. This is brought in addition to the seir nasa b'fnim that we've been talking about. From there, they learn the juxtaposition of the two, that it has to have some sort of yediyah. That's how we know it's not a case, for example, where there's no yediyah at all. That one's not going to cover it because it has to be similar in some way. That it has, at some point, there was knowledge. If not the same as the other one, okay, has knowledge at the end instead of at the beginning. So now the Gemara asks, and we're going to ask it in 2 directions. Since we're already comparing these two, why don't we say that the inner one covers both? In other words, if they're both in the pasuk, maybe the inner one could cover what the outer one covers. The nafkamina now, if you're going to bring the outer one also, then why do you need 2? Well, nafkamina let's say you didn't do the chitzon that year. So maybe this should cover you if for some reason they didn't do it. Amarkra achat. But it's not, because the Torah says, "V'chiper Aharon al karnotav achat b'shana." Okay, this is once, meaning not only once a year, which is a literal, but it can only atone for one sin, one type, not 2. Okay, that's the drasha, only one. Okay, what about the outer one? There's no pasuk about the outer one that says that. So maybe the outer one could cover, again, options 2 and 3. Right? Yediyah b'tchila, not the end, or only yediyah at the end. Nafkamina l'tumadir ben zelazeh. What would be the nafkamina? Well, you do the chitzon after you do the pnimi. So what if after you did the pnimi, you became impure, right? And you have one of these cases where you didn't know, and then where you knew at the beginning, forgot, went into the temple, or ate sacrificial meat. Well, you didn't eat, it's Yom Kippur. But then what happened? Then let's say 5 minutes after that, then later in the day they do the chitzon. Maybe that should cover you. Otherwise, you have to wait an entire year. So they say, Amar kra achat b'shana. Because it says once a year, Kaparazo lote ela achat b'shana. This kapara only happens once a year. You missed it. Sorry, you have to wait till next year. Okay, that's it for our daf. That will wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom and Besorah Tova.